April 12th, 1204. Dawn broke cold and grey over the greatest city in Christendom. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, capital of emperors for nearly 900 years, stood on the edge of catastrophe. Along the walls facing the Golden Horn, a peculiar group of warriors took their positions. These were not native Greeks or Byzantine Romans. They were men from the frozen lands of the north, from Scandinavia and the British Isles, warriors who had travelled thousands of miles to serve an emperor they revered as God's representative on earth. They were the Varangian Guard, the axe-bearing barbarians, the emperor's last line of defence, and on this April morning they would face an enemy they never imagined fighting. Fellow Christians who had come supposedly to liberate Jerusalem but who now stood poised to sack the greatest Christian city in the world. The story of how Constantinople came to face this impossible situation is one of greed, betrayal, political intrigue, and the complete corruption of a holy cause. It began 2 years earlier, in 1202, when Pope Innocent III called for what would become the Fourth Crusade. The goal was simple: reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control by first conquering Egypt, the power base of the Ayyubid Sultanate. But from the very beginning, this crusade was cursed by financial troubles and Venetian ambition. The Crusaders, largely French knights and nobility, had contracted with the Republic of Venice to build a fleet to transport their invasion force. They promised to pay 85,000 silver marks, an astronomical sum. But when the Crusaders assembled in Venice in 1202, they discovered they had grossly overestimated their numbers. Many Crusaders had sailed from other ports, and the army that appeared in Venice was far smaller than expected. They could not pay the contracted price. They owed Venice 34,000 marks they simply did not have. Enter Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, a man in his 90s who was nearly blind but possessed a cunning mind that would reshape the fate of empires. Dandolo saw an opportunity. Venice had long competed with Constantinople for control of Mediterranean trade. The Byzantine Empire, while weakened from its former glory, still controlled vital trade routes and harbours. Dandolo proposed a deal. The Crusaders would help Venice capture the city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, a Christian city that had rebelled against Venetian control and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. In exchange, Venice would defer payment of the debt. The Crusaders, desperate and with no other options, agreed. In November 1202, the Crusader army attacked and conquered Zara, sacking a Christian city. Pope Innocent III was horrified. He excommunicated the entire Crusader army, though he later lifted the ban on the knights while maintaining it on the Venetians. The crusade had already deviated from its purpose, and it was about to get much worse. While the Crusaders wintered in Zara, they received a visit that would seal Constantinople's fate. Alexios Angelos, the son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, arrived with an extraordinary proposal. His uncle, Alexios III, had overthrown and blinded his father in 1195 and seized the throne. Young Alexios promised the Crusaders that if they helped restore his father to the throne and made him co-emperor, he would pay them 200,000 silver marks, provide 10,000 troops for their crusade to Egypt, supply provisions for 1 year, and most temptingly reunite the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome under papal authority. It was an offer that solved all the Crusaders' problems. Dandolo saw it as the perfect opportunity to install a puppet emperor in Constantinople who would grant Venice favourable trading privileges. The Crusader leadership, led by Boniface of Montferrat, agreed to the plan. In June 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived at Constantinople. The city that greeted them was unlike anything the Western Europeans had ever seen. Constantinople in 1204 had a population of around 300,000, dwarfing Venice's 80,000, which was the largest city in Western Europe at the time. The city was a treasure house of art, relics, and wealth, accumulated over nearly a millennium. Its massive walls, the Theodosian walls, stretched for more than 5 kilometres from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. These walls had repelled countless invaders for 800 years. They consisted of a moat 60 feet wide, an outer wall studded with towers every 45 to 55 metres, and an inner wall even more formidable. No enemy had ever breached them except through treachery or political collapse. But the Crusaders did not need to attack the land walls. They had something the previous invaders lacked: overwhelming naval superiority provided by the Venetian fleet. The vulnerable point in Constantinople's defences was not the land walls but the sea walls along the Golden Horn, the horn-shaped estuary that penetrated deep into the heart of the city. These walls were lower and less formidable than the land walls. However, the entrance to the Golden Horn was protected by a massive chain, installed by Emperor Leo III in the 8th century. This chain, made of giant wooden links joined by immense nails and heavy iron shackles, stretched from the Tower of Eugenius on the city walls to the Tower of Galata on the opposite shore. It floated on logs and was strong enough to prevent any ship from entering the harbour. Behind this chain, Byzantine ships could mass to defend the entrance, but the chain's weakness was that one end was anchored at Galata, across the water from Constantinople proper. The Crusaders attacked Galata first. The garrison there, which included members of the Varangian Guard, fought fiercely. Contemporary accounts describe how the Varangians, seeing the Crusader knights advancing with their lances, sallied forth from the tower, hoping to catch the enemy by surprise, but they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. The Crusaders took the tower and lowered the chain, opening the Golden Horn to the Venetian fleet. This was a catastrophe for Constantinople's defences. Now the city could be attacked from two sides simultaneously, the land walls from the European side and the vulnerable sea walls along the Golden Horn. What followed was a siege unlike any Constantinople had faced. Emperor Alexios III, confronted by this unexpected threat, and realizing the city's defences had been compromised, made a decision that stunned everyone. On the night of July 17, 1203, he fled the city, taking with him 10,000 pieces of gold and priceless jewels, abandoning his wife, his children, his empire, and his people. When dawn broke, the Byzantines realized their emperor had deserted them. In desperation, they released the blinded Isaac II from his prison and restored him to the throne. His son, Alexios Angelos, the Crusaders' ally, was crowned as co-emperor Alexios IV. The Crusaders withdrew, believing their mission accomplished, but Alexios IV quickly discovered that fulfilling his extravagant promises was impossible. The Byzantine treasury simply did not have 200,000 silver marks. The empire had been bankrupted by decades of war and misrule. Alexios tried to raise money by melting down church treasures and imposing heavy taxes, which only made him deeply unpopular with his people. Anti-Latin sentiment, which had been simmering in Constantinople for decades, reached a boiling point. The presence of the Crusader army outside the walls demanding payment was seen as a humiliation. In August 1203, riots broke out. Crusaders and Venetians in the city were attacked and killed. The Westerners retaliated by starting a massive fire that burned for 3 days, from August 19th to 21st, destroying large sections of Constantinople and leaving an estimated 100,000 people homeless. The relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, never good, had collapsed into outright hatred. In January 1204, the situation reached its breaking point. The blinded Isaac II died, probably of natural causes. His son Alexios IV, isolated and despised by his own people, faced a palace coup. The leader of this coup was Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Murtzouphlos for his bushy eyebrows. Doukas was the imperial chamberlain and had won respect from both the military and the populace during the initial clashes with the Crusaders. He had a clear plan: save Constantinople by eliminating the traitorous emperor who had sold out to the Latins. On February 5, 1204, Doukas, with the support of key factions including elements of the palace guard, arrested Alexios IV. 3 days later, on February 8th, Alexios was strangled to death in his cell. Alexios Doukas was proclaimed Emperor Alexios V. This changed everything for the Crusaders. Their puppet emperor was dead, murdered. Their promised payment would never come. They had sacrificed 2 years for nothing. More importantly, they were stuck outside Constantinople with no money, no provisions, and winter approaching. In March 1204, the Crusader and Venetian leadership made a fateful decision. They would conquer Constantinople outright and divide the Byzantine Empire among themselves. They drew up a formal agreement, a treaty of partition that laid out exactly how the empire's territories and wealth would be split. 3/8 would go to the new Latin emperor they would install, 3/8 to Venice, and 1/4 to the Crusader knights. This was no longer a crusade. This was naked conquest for profit. Emperor Alexios V, knowing what was coming, worked frantically to strengthen the city's defences. He reinforced the walls along the Golden Horn, heightened towers, built wooden platforms for defenders, and conducted raids against the crusader camps to harass them and slow their preparations. Most importantly, he could count on one group of warriors whose loyalty was beyond question, the Varangian Guard. These northern warriors had no love for the Latin crusaders. Many of them were Anglo-Saxons who had fled England after the Norman conquest of 1066. They had fought the Normans at the Battle of Hastings and lost everything. Now, ironically, they would fight Normans again, for some of the crusader leaders were Normans or of Norman descent. The Varangians had also been promised by Alexius V that if they did not fight, they would be replaced by Frankish knights. This was an existential threat to their position and livelihood. They would fight to the death. The Varangian Guard in 1204 was a shadow of what it had been in its glory days under Basil II 2 centuries earlier, but it was still a formidable force. By this time, the Guard was predominantly composed of Anglo-Saxons and Danes, though some Norse and Rus warriors remained. Contemporary sources describe them as the largest, most fearsome-looking warriors in the Byzantine army. They stood out not just for their size, but for their weapons. While Byzantine soldiers typically used spears, swords, and bows, the Varangians carried massive two-handed axes, specifically the Danish long axe or Dane axe. These weapons had blades that were wide and slightly angled, designed to inflict horrific wounds. The shaft was typically 5 to 6 feet long, allowing the wielder to generate tremendous force. Byzantine chroniclers called them palakiphoroi, axe-bearing barbarians. The sight of a line of these giants wielding their axes was described as one of the most terrifying things an enemy could face. The Varangians also carried swords, typically long, single-handed, double-edged Scandinavian swords with decorated pommels and hilts, though some officers carried curved Byzantine swords. They were equipped with the best armour Byzantium could provide, lamella, scale and ringmail armour that was heavy but offered excellent protection. They carried shields, initially round in the Scandinavian style, but by the 11th and 12th centuries often kite-shaped like other Byzantine infantry. When using their two-handed axes, they would strap their shields to their backs. The Varangians fought as heavy shock infantry. Their role in battle was to hold critical positions, defend the emperor personally, and break enemy formations with devastating charges. They were specialists in close combat, and their axes could cleave through armour, shields, and even horses with a single blow. On April 9, 1204, the Crusaders launched their first major assault on Constantinople. The plan was ambitious: attack both by land and sea simultaneously. The Venetian fleet would assault the sea walls along the Golden Horn using specially constructed siege towers mounted on their largest ships, while the Crusader knights would attack the land walls. The Byzantine defenders, including the Varangian Guard, were ready. Alexios V had positioned himself at a command post next to the Pentapoptes monastery, on a steep hill just inside the wall where he could observe both the enemy fleet in the Golden Horn and the threatened fortifications. The assault began at dawn. The Venetians lashed their ships together in pairs and mounted wooden siege towers and flying bridges on them. These towers, built on the forecastles, were level with the tops of the walls, allowing marines to attempt to storm directly onto the battlements. As the ships approached, Byzantine defenders unleashed everything they had. Mangonels and catapults hurled stones at the approaching vessels. Archers fired clouds of arrows. Greek fire, that mysterious incendiary weapon that had saved Constantinople so many times before, was deployed from ships behind the walls. The fighting was brutal. The Venetian sailors and marines, protected by hides draped over their ships to soften the impact of projectiles, managed to bring their towers close enough to extend gangplanks to the walls. Hand-to-hand combat erupted on the battlements. This was where the Varangian Guard excelled. Contemporary accounts describe the fighting as extremely violent, with axes and swords clashing as both sides fought desperately. The Varangians, positioned at key points along the walls, held their ground. Their axes, swung by warriors who had trained with them since childhood, carved through shields, armour and flesh. No crusader who made it onto the walls in the section defended by the Varangians lived long. The psychological impact of facing these warriors cannot be overstated. The Crusaders were veterans of battles in the Holy Land. They had fought Saracens, Turks, and other enemies. But they had never faced anything like the Varangian Guard. These were warriors from the edge of the known world, men who fought with a ferocity that seemed almost inhuman, who wielded weapons that could split a man in two, who showed no mercy and expected none. By the end of April 9th, Despite initial successes in a few places where Venetian marines managed to capture towers, the assault had failed. The Byzantines had repelled the attack across the entire front. Crusaders and Venetians were driven back to their ships with heavy casualties. The defenders celebrated. Some accounts describe how Byzantine soldiers went up on the walls and mocked the retreating Crusaders, even pulling down their breeches and showing them their buttocks in contempt. It seemed Constantinople had held, as it had so many times before, but the Crusader leadership, particularly Dandolo, was not deterred. They had come too far and invested too much to retreat now. They regrouped, repaired their ships and siege equipment, and prepared for a second assault. This time they would be better prepared. They studied where the defences were weakest and where they had almost succeeded. They would concentrate their forces on specific points along the Golden Horn walls. April 12th, 1204, dawned with a strong north wind, ideal conditions for the Venetian assault. The wind would help drive their ships close to the walls. At sunrise, the Crusader fleet moved into position again. The assault began with a massive bombardment. Mangonels on the ships and on shore hurled stones at the walls. The Byzantines responded in kind. The air filled with projectiles, and the sound of stone striking stone, wood, and flesh created a constant thunder. Then the Venetian ships, driven by the north wind, moved forward again. This time, the assault was more focused. Instead of attacking the entire length of the walls, they concentrated on specific towers and sections, overwhelming the defenders with sheer numbers. The fighting was even more intense than April 9th. The Varangian Guard, once again positioned at critical points, fought with desperate courage. They knew that if the walls were breached, if the Crusaders got into the city in force, Constantinople was doomed. Every inch of ground was contested. Every tower was defended to the last man. Then disaster struck the defenders. At one tower, a flying bridge from a Venetian ship managed to lodge securely on the battlements. 10 knights and about 60 other soldiers scrambled across. They faced a wall of defenders, including Varangians. The fighting was savage. Axes clashed with swords, shields splintered, men screamed and died, but the Crusaders managed to establish a foothold. Then, in one of those moments that change history, a small group led by a knight named Pierre d'Amiens and a clerk named Alum de Clary noticed a bricked-up postern gate, a small door in the wall. They attacked it with whatever they had, swords, axes, even their bare hands, desperately trying to break through. Inside, Byzantine defenders waited, ready to slaughter anyone who came through, but the Crusaders kept at it, and eventually they created a hole large enough for a man to squeeze through. Alum de Clary, despite his brother trying to pull him back by the leg, scrambled through the opening. He was alone, facing a mass of Byzantine soldiers. By all rights, he should have died immediately. But sometimes in war, individual acts of insane courage can paralyze an opponent. The defenders hesitated for a crucial moment. More Crusaders poured through the breach, then another. At other points along the walls, other breaches were being made. The concentration of force was working. Byzantine defenders were being overwhelmed. Emperor Alexios V, watching from his command post, realized the walls were failing. He rode through the streets trying to rally troops, but the Byzantine army was collapsing. Soldiers were fleeing. The common people were panicking. The Varangian Guard, still fighting on the walls, found themselves increasingly isolated. They were holding their sections, but around them, the defences were crumbling. Byzantine soldiers who had fought alongside them were routing. Orders were breaking down. By afternoon, Crusaders had established multiple breachheads and were pouring into the city through holes in the walls and captured gates. The Varangian Guard faced an impossible situation. They could stand and die to the last man, defending sections of wall that no longer mattered because the enemy was already inside the city in strength. Or they could retreat and regroup to defend the imperial palaces and the emperor himself, their primary duty. That night, April 12th into 13th, Constantinople descended into chaos. Fires started by the attacking forces and desperate defenders spread through sections of the city. This was the third major fire to ravage Constantinople during this crisis, and it would burn parts of the ancient metropolis to ashes. Emperor Alexios V, realizing the situation was hopeless, made the same decision his predecessor Alexios III had made. He fled. He escaped by boat under cover of darkness, abandoning the city. The Byzantine leadership, such as it was, completely collapsed. A nobleman named Theodore Lascaris tried to rally the troops and the people for a final stand, but he found no support. The populace was demoralized, the army was beaten, even the senators who had backed various claimants to the throne were fleeing. And this is where the story of the Varangian Guard takes its most controversial turn. According to some sources, particularly the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, the Varangian Guard attempted to use the crisis to extort higher wages. They tried to negotiate for more pay before they would continue fighting. When this failed, they too fled the city. This account has been disputed by historians. Other sources suggest that the Varangians did fight until organised resistance was impossible, and only fled when there was no emperor to protect and no coherent defence to mount. Some accounts mention Varangians seeking refuge in churches, only to be burned out by crusaders who set fire to the buildings. What is certain is that by the morning of April 13, 1204, organised Byzantine resistance had ended. The Crusaders and Venetians, somewhat surprised, found themselves in control of Constantinople. There was no government to negotiate with, no army to oppose them. The city that had stood unconquered for 874 years, that had repelled Arabs, Avars, Bulgars, Russians and Turks, had fallen to a Christian army that had set out to fight Muslims in the Holy Land. What followed was one of the most notorious sacks of a city in history. For 3 days, April 13th through 15th, the Crusaders and Venetians pillaged Constantinople. The destruction was systematic and thorough. Churches and monasteries, which should have been sacred to fellow Christians, were particular targets because they housed the greatest treasures. The Hagia Sophia, the grandest church in Christendom, was desecrated. Crusaders smashed the altar, tore down silk hangings, looted gold and silver vessels, and according to some accounts, even brought horses and mules into the church to carry away the plunder. Holy relics accumulated over centuries, including pieces of the true cross, thorns from the crown of thorns, bones of saints, and countless other items of devotion were stolen or destroyed. The imperial palaces were ransacked. The Bucolion Palace, residence of emperors, surrendered to Boniface of Montferrat, who took for himself everything of value. The Blachernay Palace surrendered to Count Henry of Flanders. Priceless artworks, ancient Greek and Roman sculptures that had survived for over 1,000 years, were destroyed or melted down for their metal content. The famous bronze horses that adorned the Hippodrome were taken by the Venetians and installed at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, where they remain to this day. The human cost was equally terrible. Civilians were killed indiscriminately, women were raped, people of all ages were enslaved. While estimates vary, thousands of Constantinople's citizens died during the 3 days of sacking. The wealth looted was beyond calculation. Every crusader and Venetian sailor enriched themselves. Dandolo sent ship after ship laden with treasures back to Venice. The crusader knights filled their coffers with gold and silver. Later estimates suggested that the total plunder exceeded 900,000 silver marks, far more than Alexios IV had ever promised to pay. This was not the accident of war. This was deliberate, calculated looting on a massive scale. The Crusader leadership had agreed on how to divide the spoils even before the attack. The Treaty of Partition specified that all plunder would be gathered and divided according to the agreed proportions. In practice, this rule was widely ignored as individuals grabbed what they could, but the intent was clear from the start. On May 16th, 1204, Count Baldwin of Flanders was crowned as the first Latin emperor of Constantinople in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire was divided among the conquerors according to the treaty. Venice took 3/8, including Crete, and numerous strategic islands and ports, establishing a Mediterranean empire that would make it the dominant naval power for centuries. The Crusader nobility divided the rest, creating a patchwork of Latin kingdoms and principalities across former Byzantine territories. But significant portions of the Byzantine Empire survived unconquered. Byzantine nobles established several successor states: the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, and the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece. These states saw themselves as the true heirs to the Byzantine Empire and worked to recover Constantinople. In 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos, the Emperor of Nicaea, succeeded in recapturing Constantinople and restored the Byzantine Empire. But the empire never recovered its former strength. The sack of 1204 had broken something fundamental. The economic damage was catastrophic. The destruction of so many artworks and treasures was irreplaceable. The population had been decimated. Trust between the Eastern and Western churches, already strained, was shattered beyond repair. The Orthodox Christians would never forget that Western Christians had sacked their holiest city. The Fourth Crusade is considered one of the most cynical and disastrous events in medieval history. Pope Innocent III, who had called the crusade, was horrified when he learned what had happened. In a letter, he condemned the Crusaders for attacking fellow Christians, for the rape and murder of innocents, for the desecration of churches. But his condemnation came too late and carried no real consequences. The damage was done. The crusade never reached the Holy Land. Most of the Crusader leaders, busy carving out fiefdoms in Byzantine territory, never went further. A few contingents eventually made their way to the remnant Crusader states in the Levant, but they accomplished nothing significant. The Fourth Crusade, intended to strengthen Christendom against Islam, had instead destroyed the greatest Christian empire in the East. For the Varangian Guard, the fall of Constantinople marked the beginning of the end. Some Varangians apparently followed the Byzantine court into exile in Nicaea. The successor Byzantine states maintained military forces, and it is possible that small units of Varangian Guard served there. When Constantinople was recaptured in 1261, some form of the Varangian Guard was restored, but it was a pale shadow of the original. The influx of warriors from the north had dried up. The payment that had once made service in Constantinople so attractive was no longer available. The Byzantine Empire after 1261 was poor and shrinking, unable to maintain the large mercenary forces it once had. References to the Varangian Guard appear sporadically in the historical record after 1261. An English chronicle from 1404 mentions English axe-bearing guards at the Byzantine palace, and there are reports that some people identifying themselves as Varangians were still in Constantinople as late as 1400. But by then, the guard was more ceremonial than military, a remnant kept alive by tradition rather than necessity. The legacy of the Varangian Guard endures in unexpected ways. Across Scandinavia, runestones still stand that commemorate men who served in the Guard and returned home with wealth and honour. The runic inscriptions in the Hagia Sophia, including the famous Halfdan inscription, are physical evidence of their presence in Constantinople. The Guard's reputation influenced military organisation across Europe. The idea of an elite bodyguard composed of foreign mercenaries, chosen for their loyalty because they lacked local political connections, was copied by other rulers. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Varangian Guard is their place in the historical memory of both Scandinavia and the Byzantine world. They represent a fascinating intersection of cultures: northern warriors serving southern emperors, Vikings protecting the heir of Rome, barbarians by Byzantine standards who became the most trusted defenders of civilized emperors. Their axes, which so terrified Byzantine enemies, have become symbols of a unique chapter in medieval history. On April 12, 1204, when the Varangian Guard stood on the walls of Constantinople, facing the Crusader assault, they were upholding a tradition more than 2 centuries old. They were doing what their predecessors had done at countless battles, defending their emperor to the death. That they ultimately failed, that Constantinople fell despite their courage, was due to factors beyond their control. The city had been betrayed from within by emperors who fled, by a government that collapsed, by a population that could not be rallied. The Varangians, for all their fearsome reputation and undoubted bravery, could not hold the walls alone. The Viking Age had long since ended by 1204. The men in the Varangian Guard were no longer the same warriors who had terrorized the coasts of Europe centuries earlier. They were professional soldiers, second and third generation descendants of those who had first come to Byzantium, or Anglo-Saxon exiles still bitter about Hastings. But they carried forward the tradition of the axe-bearing warrior, the berserker who fought without fear. When Byzantine historians described the fall of Constantinople, they noted that the Varangians fought well while the rest of the army crumbled. That is perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Guard. In the moment of greatest crisis, when the city faced its doom, the northern warriors remained true to their oath. 800 years after the Fourth Crusade, Pope John Paul II twice expressed sorrow for what happened in 1204. In 2001, he wrote to the Archbishop of Athens saying it was tragic that assailants who set out to secure free access for Christians to the Holy Land turned against their brothers in the faith, and that the fact they were Latin Christians fills Catholics with deep regret. In 2004, on the 800th anniversary of the sack, he asked the Patriarch of Constantinople how we cannot share, at a distance of 8 centuries, the pain and disgust. This was as close to an official apology as the Catholic Church could make for an event that happened so long ago. The wounds of 1204 run deep in Orthodox memory. The sack of Constantinople is seen not just as a military defeat, but as a profound betrayal. It shattered the unity of Christendom and created a bitterness between East and West that persists in some ways to this day. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 is sometimes seen by Orthodox Christians as a consequence of the Latin betrayal in 1204. Had the Byzantine Empire not been shattered and weakened by the Fourth Crusade, perhaps it could have withstood the Ottoman advance. For the Varangian Guard, the men who stood on the walls that April morning 821 years ago, history remembers them as the last true defenders of Constantinople. Not the politicians who fled, not the soldiers who broke and ran, but the foreign mercenaries who held their ground even when the cause was lost. Their axes swung in defence of a city that was not their home, in service of an emperor who was not their king, for a cause that gave them no direct benefit represent the strange honour of the professional soldier. They had sworn an oath, and they kept it until keeping it was no longer possible. The thunder of their axes on crusader shields, the war cries in Norse and English that rang from the walls of Constantinople, these sounds faded into history when the city fell. But for a brief moment in April 1204, the axe-bearing barbarians of the north stood as the last line of defence for 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization. They fought not because they would win, but because it was their duty. And when duty failed and the city fell, they passed into legend as the most loyal soldiers an emperor could ever have. The Latin Empire that emerged from the ashes of Byzantium was doomed from the start. Baldwin I, crowned emperor in May 1204, ruled over a fractured realm that his crusader allies had already begun carving up like a feast day roast. The Venetians had taken the choicest cuts, the ports and islands that would feed their commercial empire for generations. The French and Flemish nobles grabbed territories in Greece and Thrace, establishing feudal principalities that replicated the political chaos of Western Europe. But none of them understood what they had destroyed. The Byzantine Empire had been more than just a collection of territories. It was a sophisticated administrative machine refined over centuries, a tax system that actually functioned, a diplomatic corps that had kept barbarian kingdoms at bay through cunning rather than force, and a professional army that, despite its failures in 1204, had protected Christendom's eastern frontier for 800 years. The Crusaders had smashed this machine and replaced it with nothing but raw military occupation. Within months of the conquest, Baldwin faced rebellions on all sides. The Bulgarian Tsar Kaloyan, who had initially offered to help the Crusaders, turned against them when he realised they intended to occupy Bulgarian lands. In April 1205, exactly 1 year after Constantinople fell, Baldwin led an army to confront Kaloyan at Adrianople. It was a disaster. The Latins were crushed, and Baldwin himself was captured. He died in Bulgarian captivity, probably tortured to death, though the exact circumstances remain disputed. His brother Henry succeeded him, and proved a more capable ruler, but the Latin Empire never controlled more than a fraction of Byzantine territory. The Greeks were not going to accept Latin rule. They had not invited these conquerors. They did not want them. And in Nicaea, Trebizond and Epirus, Byzantine courts were gathering strength, planning reconquest. Theodore Lascaris, the same nobleman who had tried to rally Constantinople's defence in April 1204, established himself as emperor in Nicaea. The city became the capital of the empire in exile, and Lascaris set about creating a functioning state from the fragments of Byzantine nobility and military that had escaped the Latin conquest. He faced immediate threats from the Latins to his west and the Seljuk Turks to his east, but through careful diplomacy and selective military action, he carved out a viable realm. More importantly, he preserved Byzantine institutions, culture, and identity. The Patriarchate of Constantinople relocated to Nicaea, giving the empire religious legitimacy. Byzantine bureaucrats recreated the administrative systems that had made the empire function. And critically, Lascaris began rebuilding a military force capable of eventually challenging the Latins. Among the soldiers who served the Empire of Nicaea were men who identified themselves as Varangians, or who claimed descent from the Guard. The evidence is fragmentary, but references in chronicles suggest that some form of axe-bearing guard unit existed in Nicaea. These may have been actual survivors from the 1204 defence who fled with the Byzantine court, or they may have been Greeks or other soldiers adopting the Varangian identity and weapons as a deliberate connection to Byzantine military tradition. The Varangian Guard had become more than just a unit. It was a symbol of Byzantine military excellence and imperial prestige. The Latin Empire, meanwhile, was slowly strangling. The crusader kingdoms in former Byzantine lands were constantly at war with their Greek neighbours, with each other, and with Bulgarian and Turkish enemies. The economic disruption caused by the conquest had been catastrophic. Constantinople, which had been the greatest commercial hub in the eastern Mediterranean, saw its trade decline dramatically. Italian merchants, particularly Venetians and Genoese, dominated what commerce remained, siphoning wealth out of the city rather than building it up. The population of Constantinople, which may have been around 400,000 before the Fourth Crusade, dropped to perhaps 100,000 or less under Latin rule. Entire districts lay in ruins, still unrepaired from the fires of 1203 and 1204. The great palaces were stripped of their treasures. The churches, once glittering with mosaics and precious metals, were bare. The city that had been the jewel of Christendom had become a hollow shell, occupied by foreigners who could not even maintain what they had conquered. By the 1230s it was clear to observers that the Latin Empire was failing. The question was not whether it would fall, but which Greek successor state would destroy it. The Empire of Nicaea had several advantages in the race to reconquer Constantinople. It was the largest and wealthiest of the Byzantine successor states. It controlled important territories in western Anatolia, including productive agricultural lands and access to trade routes. Its emperors had successfully maintained the claim to be the legitimate continuation of the Byzantine Empire, recognized by both the relocated Patriarchate and by foreign powers. And critically, Nicaea was building a navy. This was essential because Constantinople could not be taken without control of the sea. The city's land walls, even partially manned by the reduced Latin garrison, were still formidable. But control of the waters around Constantinople, the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara would allow an attacker to blockade the city and assault the weaker sea walls. The Nicaean Emperor John III Vatatzes, who ruled from 1221 to 1254, pursued a patient strategy of gradually weakening the Latins while building up Nicaean strength. He allied with Bulgaria against the Latins, defeating them in battle repeatedly. He made peace with the Seljuk Turks, securing his eastern frontier. He built up the economy, encouraging agriculture and trade, and he constructed a fleet, training Greek sailors and marines who could challenge Venetian naval supremacy. By the 1250s, the Latin Empire had been reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and a few surrounding territories. Emperor Baldwin II, who had ascended to the throne as a child in 1228, spent much of his reign travelling around Western Europe begging for military and financial help. He mortgaged Constantinople's holiest relic, the Crown of Thorns, to Venetian merchants, and King Louis IX of France had to pay to redeem it, taking it to Paris where it is housed to this day. Baldwin even sold his own son into temporary servitude to Venetian creditors to raise money. The Latin Empire was bankrupt, militarily weak, and surviving only because the Byzantine successor states were distracted by their own rivalries. The Empire of Nicaea and the Despotate of Epirus competed with each other almost as much as they fought the Latins. Michael II of Epirus briefly seemed poised to take Constantinople in the 1230s, but was defeated by John Vatatzes, who established Nicaea as the clear leader in the struggle for Byzantine restoration. The final act began in 1258 when Michael Palaiologos, a general from one of Byzantium's most prominent noble families, seized power in Nicaea through a coup. He was crowned co-emperor alongside the legitimate heir, young John IV Lascaris, but Michael was the true power. He was ambitious, ruthless, and determined to recapture Constantinople. Michael understood that he needed to neutralize the greatest threat to any assault on Constantinople, the Venetian fleet. Venice had been the military backbone of the Latin Empire from the beginning. Venetian ships controlled the waters around Constantinople. Venetian merchants dominated the city's economy. Without Venetian support, the Latin Empire would collapse. Michael pursued a brilliant diplomatic strategy. He approached Venice's greatest rival, the Republic of Genoa, and offered them a treaty. In exchange for naval support against Venice and the Latin Empire, Genoa would receive the commercial privileges that Venice currently enjoyed in Constantinople. The Genoese, who had long resented Venetian dominance in eastern Mediterranean trade, agreed. In March 1261, Nicaea and Genoa signed the Treaty of Nymphaeum. Genoa would provide naval forces to help Nicaea conquer Constantinople, and in return would become the dominant Italian commercial power in the restored Byzantine Empire. This was a masterstroke. Venice suddenly faced a credible naval threat. The Venetians had to divert forces to defend their colonies and trade routes against Genoese attacks. The noose around Constantinople was tightening. Michael assembled his forces for what he expected would be a prolonged siege. Constantinople's walls, even after decades of neglect under Latin rule, were still formidable. The city would have to be starved into submission or taken by a massive assault that would cost thousands of lives. Michael prepared for a long campaign, but in July 1261, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos was conducting reconnaissance near Constantinople with a force of about 800 soldiers. He made contact with citizens inside the city who were tired of a Latin rule and desperate for liberation. They informed him that the Venetian fleet had sailed to attack a Nicaean island in the Black Sea, and that Baldwin had taken most of the Latin garrison with him on a raid into Nicaean territory. Constantinople was practically undefended. Strategopoulos could hardly believe his luck, but he was a bold commander. On the night of July 25th, 1261, his troops infiltrated the city through a secret passage. The details vary in different accounts, but the essential facts are clear. A small force of Nicaean soldiers got inside Constantinople with the help of Greek citizens. They overpowered what guards they encountered and opened gates to let in the rest of Strategopoulos' force. When Baldwin II learned that enemy troops were in the city, he panicked and fled, escaping by ship to the Latin-controlled island of Euboea. The Latin garrison, what little remained, was overwhelmed. Some fought and were killed, others surrendered. The Venetian merchants and other Latin civilians fled to ships in the harbour, abandoning their homes and possessions. Many of the Greek citizens of Constantinople poured into the streets, celebrating liberation after 57 years of foreign occupation. On August 15, 1261, exactly 57 years after the city had fallen to the Fourth Crusade, Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople in triumph. He walked through the Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance used by victorious emperors, following the ancient route to the Hagia Sophia. There, he was crowned again as Emperor of the Romans, restoring the Byzantine Empire in its ancient capital. The crowd that witnessed this moment included aging men and women who had been children during the Latin conquest, who remembered the sack, the fires, the destruction, and now lived to see their city return to Greek rule. But the Constantinople that Michael reclaimed was not the city that had fallen in 1204. The population was a fraction of what it had been. Entire districts remained ruined and abandoned. The great palaces had been looted of everything valuable. The Hagia Sophia's interior, stripped of its treasures by the Latins, looked bare. The city's infrastructure, its aqueducts and cisterns, its harbours and walls, had suffered from decades of neglect. The Latin rulers had extracted wealth from Constantinople, but invested nothing in its maintenance or restoration. Michael faced the enormous task of rebuilding not just a city, but an empire. The restored Byzantine Empire of 1261 was much smaller than the empire that had existed before 1204. Large territories in Greece and the Aegean remained under Latin control. The Empire of Trebizond and the Despotate of Epirus refused to accept Michael's authority, claiming their own legitimacy as Byzantine successors, and most ominously, Anatolia was increasingly falling under the control of Turkish beyliks, small principalities that would eventually coalesce into the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantine military, which had once fielded tens of thousands of native troops supported by foreign mercenaries, was now heavily dependent on foreign soldiers. Michael could not afford to maintain a large standing army. The empire's economy had been devastated. He relied on Italian mercenaries, Turkish allies, and various opportunistic adventurers. Among the foreign soldiers in Michael's service were men who called themselves Varangians, or who served in units designated as the Varangian Guard. But by the 1260s, the Guard was nothing like what it had been in its glory days. The influx of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon warriors that had sustained the Guard for 2 centuries had ended. No new recruits were coming from the north. The men who served in the restored Varangian Guard were likely a mix of descendants of earlier guardsmen, possibly some Greek soldiers who had adopted Varangian identity and equipment, and perhaps a handful of actual northerners who found their way to Constantinople through various routes. References to the Varangian Guard appear in Byzantine sources from the restored empire, but they are brief and tell us little about the unit's actual composition or capabilities. What seems clear is that the Guard was maintained more for ceremonial and symbolic reasons than for military necessity. Having axe-bearing Varangians in the palace connected Michael's restored empire to the glorious Byzantine past. It demonstrated continuity, showing that despite the catastrophe of 1204, Byzantium endured. Michael VIII ruled until 1282, spending his reign trying to secure the restored empire against threats from all sides. His greatest challenge came from Charles of Anjou, the brother of the King of France, who had conquered Sicily and southern Italy, and now dreamed of conquering Constantinople and making himself emperor. Charles assembled a massive invasion force and made an alliance with Venice, which wanted revenge for losing its privileged position in Constantinople to Genoa. By 1281, it seemed inevitable that Constantinople would face another Latin assault, this time from a much more formidable enemy than Baldwin II's bankrupt Latin Empire. Michael used every weapon he had: diplomacy, bribery, espionage, and assassination plots. In March 1282, his efforts paid off in an unexpected way. The Sicilian Vespers, a rebellion against Charles of Anjou's rule in Sicily, erupted into a massacre of French occupiers. Sicily broke away from Charles's control, and the invasion force he had assembled to attack Constantinople was diverted to trying to reconquer Sicily. Michael's empire was saved, but the emperor died later that year, exhausted by decades of struggle. The Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologos dynasty that Michael founded would survive for another 190 years, but it was a shadow of its former greatness. It was constantly shrinking, losing territory to Serbs, Bulgarians, Latins, and increasingly to the Ottoman Turks. By 1300, the empire in Anatolia had almost completely collapsed, overrun by Turkish beyliks. The Ottomans, who emerged as the dominant Turkish power in the early 14th century, began systematically conquering Byzantine territories. By 1400, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself, a few islands, and the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. The city that had once ruled an empire spanning from Italy to the Euphrates now controlled a territory measured in miles rather than provinces. Throughout this long decline, the Varangian Guard persisted in some form. The evidence is fragmentary and often ambiguous, but references to axe-bearing guards in imperial service appear in sources up to the early 15th century. A Latin source from 1404 specifically mentions English guards in the service of the Byzantine emperor. If accurate, this is remarkable, suggesting that more than 3 centuries after the first Anglo-Saxons joined the Guard after Hastings, descendants or successors still served in Constantinople. But by this point, the Guard was certainly tiny, possibly numbering in the dozens rather than the hundreds or thousands of earlier eras. The Varangian Guard's final appearance in history is appropriately mysterious and fitting. When Constantinople faced its final siege by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II in 1453, the defending garrison was pitifully small. Emperor Constantine XI had perhaps 7,000 defenders, including soldiers from Venice and Genoa who had volunteered or been hired to help defend Christendom's greatest city against the Turks. Among these defenders were men identified in some sources as Varangians or as the emperor's guards armed with axes. The sources are not clear enough to say definitively that the Varangian Guard as an organised unit still existed in 1453. But it is fitting to imagine that when Constantine XI made his last stand on the walls of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, somewhere among his personal retainers were men carrying the axes that had been the symbol of imperial protection for more than 4 centuries. When the walls finally broke and Ottoman soldiers poured into the city, Constantine tore off his imperial regalia and died fighting as a common soldier. His body was never definitively identified, lost among the thousands of dead. If any Varangians still served him, they died there too, the last of a line stretching back to the days when Vikings first came to Byzantium seeking gold and glory. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the end of the Middle Ages in the traditional historical narrative. The city that had preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian orthodoxy for over 1,000 years fell to a Muslim empire. The Ottomans would rule Constantinople, which they renamed Istanbul, for the next 470 years. The Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque. The Great Walls were repaired and strengthened, but now defended a Turkish rather than Christian city. The legacy of Byzantium survived in unexpected ways. The last Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest brought ancient Greek texts to Italy, helping spark the Renaissance. The Byzantine legal tradition influenced the development of law codes across Europe. The Orthodox Church, which had been the spiritual heart of Byzantium, survived and spread, eventually reaching from Greece to Russia to Ethiopia. And in the collective memory of Orthodox Christians, Byzantium remained a lost golden age, a Christian empire that had stood for 1,000 years before being destroyed by Muslim conquest, and, critically, by Latin betrayal in 1204. The Varangian Guard's place in history is unique. They were foreigners who became the most trusted defenders of Byzantine emperors. They were barbarians by Roman standards who became the symbol of imperial power. They were mercenaries motivated by gold who gained fame for loyalty unto death. Their journey from Viking raiders who terrorized Christian Europe to Christian soldiers defending the Christian capital of the East is one of history's great transformations. The Varangian Guard's military legacy is also significant. They demonstrated the effectiveness of heavy shock infantry in an era increasingly dominated by cavalry. Their axes, while primitive compared to swords and spears, proved devastatingly effective in close combat. Their combination of size, strength, armour, and weapon created a warrior type that was genuinely feared by enemies who outnumbered and sometimes out-equipped them. Byzantine commanders learned to use Varangians as a decisive striking force, holding them in reserve and committing them at critical moments when their psychological impact and combat power could break enemy formations. The Guard's reputation often did half the work before they even engaged, as enemies would sometimes refuse to close with the axe-bearing giants. The cultural impact of the Varangian Guard extended far beyond the battlefield. In Scandinavia, service in the Guard became a mark of prestige. Returning Varangians were celebrated in sagas and skaldic poetry. They brought back not just wealth, but also new ideas, exposure to Byzantine culture, Orthodox Christianity in some cases, and skills in everything from architecture to literacy. Some runestones in Sweden and Norway commemorate men who died in the East, a term that often meant service in Byzantium. These stones are physical evidence of how deeply the Varangian adventure affected Northern European culture. The Guard also influenced Byzantine perceptions of Northern Europeans. Byzantine sources consistently describe Varangians as exceptionally large, strong, brave, and loyal but also crude, heavy drinkers, and dangerous when angered. These stereotypes shaped how Byzantines thought about the northern world for centuries. The image of the axe-bearing barbarian became an archetype in Byzantine art and literature, representing raw power in service to civilization. In modern popular culture, the Varangian Guard has become romanticized as the Viking Imperial Guard, a concept that captures popular imagination. Video games, novels, and television shows have featured Varangian Guardsmen as characters or plot elements. This modern interest reflects something genuine about the historical Varangian Guard that makes them compelling. They were real people who made extraordinary journeys from the edge of the medieval world to its centre. They served emperors who commanded wealth and power that must have seemed godlike to warriors from small Scandinavian kingdoms or Anglo-Saxon England. They fought in battles that decided the fate of empires, and they maintained their distinct identity and traditions even while serving a foreign ruler in a strange land. The runestones and runic graffiti they left behind, particularly the inscriptions in the Hagia Sophia, are poignant reminders that these were individuals with names, families, and lives beyond their service as imperial guards. Halfdan, who carved his name in runes on a balustrade in the Hagia Sophia sometime in the 11th century, could not have known that his casual graffiti would survive for 1,000 years, a more lasting monument than most emperors achieved. The military evolution represented by the Varangian Guard is also worth considering. When the Guard was established in 988, warfare in the Byzantine Empire was dominated by cavalry, both heavy cataphract shock cavalry and lighter horse archers. Infantry was important but often relegated to defensive roles. The Varangians demonstrated that heavy infantry, properly equipped and employed, could be a decisive offensive weapon. Their success influenced Byzantine military organisation, leading to greater emphasis on infantry formations in the 11th and 12th centuries. This was part of a broader medieval military trend toward more balanced forces, combining cavalry and infantry in complementary roles. The Varangian Guard's specialisation in close combat with two-handed weapons also anticipated later medieval developments. The two-handed sword and poleaxe-wielding infantry of the 14th and 15th centuries owed something to the earlier Varangian tradition of using large two-handed axes. The idea that infantry armed with long-handled cutting weapons could stand against and defeat cavalry was proven by the Varangians centuries before Swiss pike squares and English longbowmen made it conventional wisdom. In this sense, the Varangian Guard was ahead of its time, a preview of military developments that would not fully mature until after the Guard itself had faded into history. The Varangian Guard's relationship with the emperors they served was complex and sometimes contradictory. They were utterly loyal, but also potentially dangerous. Their oath was to the emperor personally, not to the Byzantine state or the imperial office. This meant that during succession crises or coups, the Varangians could be caught in impossible situations where legitimate claims conflicted. Generally, they sided with the sitting emperor, but if that emperor was deposed or killed, they would transfer their loyalty to the successor, assuming he was recognized as legitimate. The Varangians were also used by emperors for tasks that required absolute discretion and brutality. They were the emperor's enforcers, carrying out arrests, executions, and suppression of revolts. This dark side of their service is less celebrated than their battlefield exploits, but was equally important to their role in the Byzantine state. An emperor needed warriors who would obey orders without question, who had no local loyalties that might cause them to hesitate, and who were feared enough that their mere presence could prevent resistance. The Varangian Guard fulfilled this need perfectly. When a Varangian axe came for you, it was because the emperor had ordered your death and nothing would stop it. The payment of the Guard was also significant in Byzantine politics. The Varangians were expensive, probably the most highly paid unit in the Byzantine military. They received regular salaries, bonuses for special service, and most famously, the right to plunder the imperial treasury upon an emperor's death, taking as much gold as they could carry. This last privilege, called the Polutesvaf or palace pillage, was unique to the Varangian Guard and reflects both their special status and the Byzantine understanding that keeping the Guard satisfied was essential to imperial security. An underpaid Varangian Guard would be an invitation to coup plots and assassination attempts. By ensuring the Varangians were wealthy and well treated, emperors bought their loyalty. This was expensive but cheaper than the alternative. The gold that flowed north from Constantinople to Scandinavia and Anglo-Saxon England via returning Varangians had economic effects in those regions. It stimulated trade, encouraged the development of merchant networks to exchange the gold for goods, and helped monetize northern European economies that had previously been largely barter-based. In this way, the Varangian Guard served as a mechanism for wealth transfer from the rich Byzantine Empire to poorer northern Europe, with broader economic and social consequences. The religious dimension of Varangian Guard service is also worth examining. The earliest Varangians came from pagan or recently Christianized societies. Service in Constantinople, the greatest Christian city, exposed them to Orthodox Christianity in its most developed form. The Hagia Sophia, with its magnificent architecture and elaborate liturgy, must have been overwhelming to warriors from small wooden churches in Scandinavia. Many Varangians converted to Orthodox Christianity during their service or deepened their Christian faith. Some became quite devout, commissioning icons or making pilgrimages to holy sites. The Varangian Guard also included soldiers who were already Christian when they arrived, particularly the Anglo-Saxons. For them, service in Constantinople was not religiously challenging, though the differences between Western and Eastern Christianity, which would eventually cause the Great Schism of 1054, may have been confusing. The Guard's religious identity became more complex as its composition shifted. By the 13th and 14th centuries, if Orthodox Greeks served in what was still called the Varangian Guard, then the unit had lost its character as foreign barbarian protectors and become just another Byzantine military unit with an archaic name. This transformation, if it occurred, would represent the complete assimilation of the Varangian tradition into Byzantine culture, the foreign becoming native over generations. The final question historians ask about the Varangian Guard is whether they were worth their cost. Did they justify the enormous expense of maintaining them? The answer appears to be yes, at least during their prime from 988 to around 1204. The Guard provided emperors with a military force they could trust absolutely, a capability that was literally invaluable given Byzantium's constant internal intrigues and coups. The Varangians' combat effectiveness in crucial battles, from Basil II's conquest of Bulgaria to the defence of Constantinople against multiple sieges, demonstrated their military value. Their psychological impact on enemies and on Byzantine subjects who saw them as symbols of imperial power had effects that are hard to quantify but were certainly significant. And the diplomatic benefits of having famous northern warriors in imperial service, which impressed foreign ambassadors and reinforced Byzantium's image as a world power, added to their worth. The cost of maintaining the Varangian Guard was high, but the cost of not having them, risking emperor assassination, losing critical battles, or projecting weakness would have been higher. This cost-benefit calculation changed over time as Byzantium grew weaker and poorer. By the late 13th century, maintaining even a small Varangian Guard was probably more about tradition and symbolism than military necessity. But by then, the Guard was a shadow anyway, a remnant kept alive more as a connection to Byzantium's glorious past than as a functioning military unit. This itself reveals something important about Byzantine culture, the deep reverence for tradition, for maintaining connections to the imperial past, even when material circumstances had drastically changed. The Byzantine Empire in its final centuries was in many ways a performance of empire, maintaining the forms and titles of imperial power long after the substance had eroded. The Varangian Guard, or what remained of it, was part of this performance, a reminder that this was still the empire of the Romans, heir to Constantine and Justinian, even if its territory had shrunk to little more than a city and its army to a few thousand men. When we look back at the Varangian Guard from the distance of more than 5 centuries since their disappearance, what should we remember? Perhaps most importantly, they represent the unexpected connections that shaped medieval history. Who would have imagined that Vikings from Scandinavia and Anglo-Saxon warriors from England would become the most trusted protectors of Greek emperors in Constantinople? Yet this happened and persisted for centuries. The medieval world was more interconnected and cosmopolitan than we sometimes realize. Ideas, people, and traditions moved across vast distances. The Varangian Guard embodied this interconnection, bringing Northern European military traditions into the heart of the Byzantine Empire and taking Byzantine culture back to the north. They also remind us that loyalty and identity are complex. These foreign warriors developed genuine loyalty to emperors and an empire that was not theirs by birth. They adopted Byzantine culture while maintaining their distinct identity. They were simultaneously outsiders and insiders, barbarians and imperial elite. This complexity is lost when we reduce them to simple stereotypes of Viking mercenaries or axe-wielding bodyguards. The real Varangians were more interesting, more human, than any stereotype can capture. On April 12, 1204, when the last Varangians fought on Constantinople's walls against the crusader assault, they were fighting not just for an emperor or for pay, but for a world they had become part of. Their defeat that day marked not just a military loss, but the end of an era. The Byzantine world that had created the Varangian Guard, and that the Guard had served for more than 2 centuries, was shattered by the Fourth Crusade. It would be restored but never recovered. The Varangians who survived 1204 passed into a diminished world where their unique role no longer fit. Some served in the successor states, some may have returned north, some probably settled in former Byzantine territories and disappeared into the population. Their axes, which had once been symbols of imperial power feared across the medieval world, became curiosities, artifacts of a vanished past. But their legend survived. In both Byzantine and Scandinavian sources, in Anglo-Saxon chronicles and Icelandic sagas, the Varangian Guard lived on as a symbol of what was possible when courage, loyalty and skill combined in service to something greater than oneself. They were the axe-bearing barbarians who became the defenders of civilization, and their story remains one of the most remarkable chapters in medieval military history.